I never planned on working as a security guard. It wasn't my dream job, but after months of being unemployed, I couldn't turn down the opportunity at the Mayo Clinic Hospital. The pay was decent, the benefits were good, and most importantly, the night shift was supposed to be quiet. Or at least, that's what I thought. On my first night, the supervisor, a middle-aged man with tired eyes named Mr. Warren, showed me around the building. It was massive with endless hallways, surgically clean rooms, and fluorescent lights that gave the place a cold, sterile feel. During the tour, he went over the basic duties. Monitor the cameras, do rounds, and report any unusual activity. When the tour ended, he handed me a sealed envelope. Read this before you start. And remember, follow the instructions to the letter. Confused, I opened the envelope and found a piece of paper with the title, Night Shift Rules. The first few lines were standard. Don't let strangers in, check locked doors. Make sure the alarms are working. But as I kept reading, the rules started to get strange. 1. If you see someone in a gray uniform walking down the hallway, do not make eye contact. Leave the area immediately and notify your supervisor. 2. If you hear a child crying or calling for help, ignore it. There are no children in the hospital during the night shift. 3. Do not enter the basement for any reason, even if requested by a superior. 4. At 3:13 a.m., all the camera monitors will shut off for 15 seconds. Do not try to restart them. Just wait. There were more rules, but they all followed the same bizarre pattern. It was like someone had turned a creepy pasta into work instructions. I looked at Mr. Warren, expecting him to laugh and say it was all a joke. But he was serious. These rules are real, and you'll understand that soon enough. Trust me, it's better to follow them to the letter. That night dragged on. Every step down the hallway seemed to echo louder than it should, and every shadow seemed to move at the edge of my vision. I tried to ignore the unease, convincing myself it was just some stories made up to scare new employees. But when the clock hit 3:13, the monitors really did turn off. I was in the surveillance room alone, and the silence that followed was absolute. 15 seconds never felt so long. When the monitors came back on, something seemed off. In the hallway of the West Wing, where I had just walked minutes before, there was a figure, a man with his back to the camera, wearing a gray uniform. He was standing still, right in the middle of the hallway. The air in the room felt heavier, and my breath quickened. The words of rule number 1 echoed in my mind. Do not make eye contact. Leave the area immediately. But I was in the surveillance room. I was safe, right? Then he started to slowly turn his head, as if he knew I was watching. My heart raced, and a question overwhelmed my mind. Is he seeing me? I forced myself to look away from the screen, but something stopped me. It was like an invisible chain was pulling me back to the image on the monitor. The man in the gray uniform was now completely still, but his head was turned toward the camera, as if staring directly at me. There was no way he could know I was watching. The room seemed to shrink around me. I knew I needed to do something, but every fiber of my body screamed not to leave. The rule was clear. Do not make eye contact. Leave the area immediately. My hands were sweating as I searched for the radio on my belt to call Mr. Warren. My voice came out shaky. Sir, there's someone in the West Wing, a man in a gray uniform. The radio stayed silent for a moment too long. Finally, Mr. Warren's voice responded, colder than I expected. Get out of there, now, and don't look at him again. Do you hear me? Leave the surveillance room and do your rounds in another area. My instinct was to obey, but my mind was filled with questions. Who was that man? Why was he there? And, more importantly, what would happen if I didn't follow the rules? I made an effort to turn off the monitor showing the West Wing. With trembling hands, I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the opposite hallway, trying to ignore the chill running down my spine. The sound of my footsteps echoed through the empty hospital, each echo blending with the distant hum of the ventilation system. As I walked, I heard something, a low sound, almost imperceptible. Footsteps? They sounded close, but I saw no one when I pointed the flashlight. Probably just my mind playing tricks, I muttered, trying to calm myself. But then, the sound grew louder. It wasn't just footsteps. It was like something was following me. The sound moved in the same rhythm as mine, stopping when I stopped. I looked around, trying to stay calm. Nothing, just empty hallways and the faint glow of fluorescent lights. I decided to quicken my pace. The farther I got from the West Wing, the better. The radio crackled again, pulling me out of my thoughts. "Are you far from the West Wing?" It was Warren, but his voice sounded more urgent this time. "Yes, I'm in the South Wing now." "Good. Don't go back to the West Wing until I give the signal. And under no circumstances should you try to investigate him." The last word made my heart race. I didn't want to ask who he was. I didn't want to know. But a part of me felt like I was already in the middle of something much bigger than I expected. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps stopped. The hallway in front of me became eerily silent, and the only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my chest. Then, I felt it, a weight, not physical, but as if something was watching me. Slowly and hesitantly, I turned my head. At the end of the hallway, the light flickered rapidly, revealing a silhouette, tall, motionless, and familiar. It was the man in the gray uniform. He was standing there at the other end of the hospital, but something was wrong with him. The light flickered again, and this time, he wasn't at the end of the hallway anymore. He was closer. The air grew heavy, and panic overtook me. I turned to run, but as I took the first step, a low, rough voice whispered right behind me, "You shouldn't have looked." I didn't wait to see if that voice was real or just a trick of my mind. My instinct screamed at me to run, and that's exactly what I did. My footsteps echoed through the empty hospital hallways as I tried to ignore the cold clinging to my skin. No matter how fast I ran, the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I reached the elevator and pressed the button repeatedly, but the indicator light wouldn't turn on. It was stuck. A low, growing sound began to fill the air, like a distant hum. I turned my head and saw, in the reflection on the elevator glass, a shadow that seemed to be growing behind me. There was no one there when I turned around, but the hum wouldn't stop. My radio crackled, almost making me drop it. "You're in the South Wing, right?" Mr. Warren's voice was colder than before, heavy with something that sounded like fear. "Yes," I gasped. "Something's here with me. It's moving." Warren stayed silent for a moment too long. When he finally responded, his words were calculated. "It's testing you. Don't run anymore. You'll just make things worse. Find a safe place. Stay there until I give the signal. And for God's sake, don't look at it again." My hands shook as I gripped the radio. Staying still felt like suicide, but something in Warren's tone told me he knew more than he was letting on. I looked around, trying to find somewhere to hide. There was a supply room just a few meters away. I gripped the flashlight tightly and ran toward it. As soon as I entered, I closed the door behind me and locked it. I leaned my head against the wood, breathing heavily as I tried to calm down. But the silence in the room was almost worse. The hospital felt dead, without the hum of machines or the footsteps of other staff. It was as if I was in an isolated world. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a monitor on one of the walls. There shouldn't have been monitors in a supply room. The screen flickered to life, showing the hallway outside. There was nothing there, just emptiness. Then the image changed. Somehow, the camera was focused on me, inside the room. I saw my own figure, hunched against the door, exactly as I was. My heart nearly stopped. The sound of the radio returned, but this time it was pure static. The words that came through were muffled, distorted. "You looked. It's too late." The monitor flickered again. The camera now showed the main hallway of the south wing. In the middle of the hallway stood him, the man in gray. But something was different. His silhouette was less human. His arms seemed longer, his legs bent at strange angles. He took a step, then another, and with each movement, his shape seemed to shift, becoming something monstrous. I backed away from the door, trying not to make any noise. The monitor flickered once more, and now he was standing directly outside the room. I kicked my foot against a metal cart, and the sound echoed loudly. The camera showed his head slowly turning toward the door. He knew where I was. The radio crackled one last time, and this time it was Warren's voice. "If he enters, don't let him touch you." My heart was pounding in my chest as the doorknob slowly began to turn, accompanied by the sound of something scraping against the wood. The room's light flickered. I felt the air grow colder, as if life itself was being sucked out of the environment. Then, the monitor flickered to black, leaving only one word in white letters on the screen. "Leave." A deafening bang shook the door, and in that instant, I realized it wasn't going to hold for much longer. The supply room door trembled under the force of repeated impacts, each hit stronger than the last. My eyes were fixed on the doorknob, turning erratically, as if something on the other side was desperately trying to get in. The heavy breathing from the other side mixed with the sound of something sharp scraping against the wood. It wasn't human anymore. Not anymore. My mind was in chaos. Stay or leave. Obey the message on the screen, or trust the flimsy protection of the door. Before I could decide, the light flickered again and I heard a low sound, like something oozing. I looked down and saw a black, thick substance sliding under the door. It spread out, taking the shape of tendrils that were crawling toward me. Without thinking, I backed up to the far end of the room, knocking over shelves and supplies in my haste. The message on the monitor echoed in my mind. Leave. My heart screamed that staying was the worst choice. When the first tentacle touched my boot, the cold sliced through my skin like a knife. I jumped back and moved toward the door. With one last silent prayer, I unlocked it and pulled the handle. The hallway was empty, but the air was thick, oppressive. I ran without looking back, feeling like the darkness was chasing me. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every corner whispered words I couldn't understand. The floor creaked beneath my feet, like the hospital itself was trying to swallow me whole. The radio crackled again. "Don't go to the elevator." Warren's voice came through, firm but low. "Use the stairs. He controls the elevator." I tried to respond, but the radio just buzzed with static. I swallowed hard and followed the instructions, heading toward the nearest stairwell. With every step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It was like invisible eyes were fixed on my back. The silence was so deep that even my breathing felt like a scream. When I reached the stairwell door, I noticed something off. It was slightly ajar, but there were deep scratches on the floor, like claws had raked the metal. I hesitated for a moment, but the sound of something heavy moving through the halls pushed me to keep going. I opened the door and stepped inside. The stairwell was plunged into darkness, except for the faint light flickering above me. I began to descend, trying to make as little noise as possible. The air in there was even colder, and with each step, the metallic scent of blood seemed to grow stronger. On the third floor, I stopped dead in my tracks. I heard footsteps. Not mine. They were heavy and slow, coming from one floor above. I brought the flashlight closer, illuminating the spiral staircase. For a moment, I saw something that froze my blood. The shadow of the gray man stretched across the wall, but it was distorted, as if he were larger, with limbs that extended at impossible angles. I turned off the flashlight and pressed myself against the wall, holding my breath. The footsteps grew louder, closer. My heart was pounding so fast I thought it might give me away. When the steps stopped, the silence that followed was even more terrifying. It felt like something was standing just above me, waiting. I tried to move slowly, but then a muffled scream echoed through the building. It wasn't human, but something primal, full of rage and desperation. Without thinking, I rushed down the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, ignoring the risk of falling. The screams grew louder, and then I heard another sound, quick footsteps, rushing down after me. My feet reached the last flight of stairs, but when I pulled the door, it didn't open. The handle turned, but it felt jammed. The sound behind me grew louder, and I could feel the air getting colder. Something was very close. I was out of options. I spun around, ready to face whatever came at me. What I saw nearly made me fall. The gray man stood in the middle of the staircase, his tall, misshapen figure covered in pulsating shadows. His eyes glowed like smoldering coals, and a wide smile, full of sharp teeth, split his face. He raised a grotesque arm toward me, and the room seemed to grow darker. The radio on my belt crackled again. This time it wasn't Warren. It was a distorted voice, low, but clear enough to understand. "You are breaking the rules." The door behind me slammed open on its own, and I stumbled backward, falling to the ground. When I looked up, the gray man was no longer on the stairs, but his presence still seemed to fill the air. The voice on the radio repeated, now louder and more menacing. "Now, you belong to him." The sound of the door closing behind me echoed like a final verdict, and I realized I was no longer on a normal floor of the hospital. The hallway in front of me was different, with walls covered in something that looked like living flesh, pulsating. An unbearable stench of decay flooded my nose, and at the end of the corridor, a red light flickered slowly, like a warning. Unsure what to do, I took a step forward and felt the floor give way beneath me. My breathing was quick as I watched the hallway ahead of me. The walls pulsed, alive, as if the hospital's structure had transformed into something organic, something conscious. Each step I took made the floor emit a wet sound, as though I were stepping on raw flesh. The smell of rot became unbearable, a mix of dried blood and sulfur that made my stomach churn. The red light at the end of the corridor flickered, casting light on walls covered in veins and claw marks. They seemed to vibrate slightly, as if reacting to my presence. I tried to steady my racing heart, but the sound of the beats echoed in my ears, like a drum summoning something or someone. The radio on my belt crackled again, but this time the voice was indistinct, filled with static. I pressed my ear against it, hoping to hear something comprehensible. "Don't look, eyes." The message was cut off, and the radio turned off on its own. "Don't look at what?" My hands shook as I held the flashlight, trying to focus on moving forward. Every step was a conscious effort to ignore the urge to run, to escape. Something told me that any sudden movement would draw unwanted attention. As I was halfway down the hallway, I heard it, a slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor, followed by an irregular, wet breath. I stopped dead in my tracks, throat dry, and looked back. The hallway behind me was swallowed in darkness, but the sound was definitely coming from there. I switched off the flashlight, praying it couldn't see me. My heart pounded so loudly it felt like it could betray my position. That's when I realized. The sound wasn't behind me anymore. It was in front. The red light at the end of the hallway flickered more intensely, and for a fraction of a second, I saw it. It was a tall, deformed figure, covered in exposed flesh, pulsing like the walls. Its eyes were just dark cavities, but I felt the weight of its gaze on me. It stood there, motionless, as if waiting for me to take the next step. I tried to control my breath and started to slowly back up. But the moment I took the first step back, the sound of claws scraping the walls filled the corridor. It wasn't coming from it, but from the walls themselves, as if the structure were alive and moving. The creature took a step forward, the sound of its feet crushing the floor, reverberating through the hallway. I tried to avert my gaze, but I couldn't. The feeling of being watched was unbearable, as if its non-existent eyes were piercing through me. "Please," I whispered, not even sure who or what I was speaking to. The red light stopped flickering and went out completely, plunging the hallway into absolute darkness. My body froze, and the only sound was the irregular breathing of the creature, now very close. That's when something touched my shoulder. Not a hand, but something cold and slimy that slid down my arm. My instincts took over, and I ran. I didn't know where I was going, didn't know if I was heading in the right direction, but my legs moved on their own. I heard the creature's screams behind me, a high-pitched sound that seemed to tear through my soul. The hallway seemed endless, but I finally spotted a door. My trembling fingers gripped the handle, and I pushed it with all my strength. Behind me, the creature's sound grew louder, as if it was running toward me. I entered and slammed the door shut, locking it immediately. I leaned against the door, my chest rising and falling rapidly. But what I saw in front of me almost made me lose my balance. I wasn't in a regular hallway anymore. The room was a circular amphitheater with rows of seats rising in a spiral. Each seat was occupied by a pale, faceless figure, all turned in my direction. In the center of the room, a surgical table was illuminated by an intense white light. There was something on the table, something covered by a blood-stained sheet. My radio crackled again. This time, the voice was clear, but filled with dread. "You shouldn't be here. He's going to wake up." Before I could react, I heard the sound of something moving beneath the sheet. The silence in the amphitheater was suffocating, broken only by the irregular sound of my breathing. The figures seated, motionless like statues, seemed to watch me even without eyes. The sheet on the surgical table fluttered slightly, as if something alive was underneath it. The white light illuminated only the center, leaving the rest of the room in unsettling shadows. I didn't know what to do. Every fiber of my body screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. The only exit was the door behind me, and going back to that pulsating hallway wasn't an option. My flashlight was off, but at that moment, holding it seemed pointless. All I could do was stare at the scene in front of me, fighting to keep the panic at bay. The radio on my belt crackled again, the static feeling more alive, more dense. A voice formed through the noise, but it was different this time. It wasn't a human voice. "You brought this here." I swallowed hard, feeling sweat run down my neck. The figures around me seemed to lean slightly toward the table, as if they were waiting for something. It was impossible to tell whether they were actually bodies or just some grotesque illusion created by the light and shadows. The sheet moved again, this time more forcefully. Something was waking up, something that seemed to respond to my presence. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, some strange experiment they had left behind, but the energy in the room said otherwise. This wasn't natural. With hesitant steps, I approached the table. Curiosity, mixed with terror, pulled me like a magnet. Each step felt like a mistake, but I couldn't stop. When I finally reached the edge of the table, I extended my hand to the sheet, my heart beating so loudly I could hear it in my ears. "Don't touch," a voice whispered behind me. I spun quickly, but there was no one. The figures in the seats remained motionless, and the feeling of being watched intensified. The light flickered for a moment, and I had the impression that some of the figures had shifted positions, turning slightly to face me more directly. I ignored the warning. My trembling hand grabbed the corner of the sheet. The fabric was cold and damp, as if it had been soaked in icy water. I took a deep breath, closing my eyes for a moment before pulling. What I saw beneath the sheet nearly made my mind crumble. It was a body, but not human. The skin was translucent, showing pulsating veins full of dark liquid. Its eyes were open, glowing with a supernatural silver hue. It didn't move, but I knew with every fiber of my being that it was not dead. Before I could move away, the creature slowly opened its mouth. No sound came from it, but the air around me seemed to be sucked in, as if the whole room were holding its breath. The radio on my belt exploded with static, and the voice returned, more desperate than before. "Get out of there. He's waking up." You don't understand what you've done." The white light began to flicker rapidly, casting the room into a horrifying game of shadows. The body on the table began to stir, moving slowly and deliberately, as if waking from a deep sleep. The figures in the seats started to rise, moving with rigid, almost mechanical motions, but all turning to face me. I felt a vibration beneath my feet. It was like an earthquake, but much subtler, as if it were coming from inside the hospital. I looked at the table and saw the creature turn its head toward me, its bright eyes locking onto mine. And then, with a voice that seemed to echo inside my mind, it spoke for the first time. "Why did you come?" The ground beneath me cracked, and a red light began to glow from below, as if something was trying to emerge. The sound of distorted laughter and whispers grew around me, and before I could react, the table began to sink, taking the creature with it. The figures in the seats moved slowly forward, blocking all exits. My feet were stuck to the floor, as if some invisible force was holding my body in place. The radio on my belt hissed again, but this time all I heard was a scream, one that seemed to be my own. That's when I realized I wasn't in the hospital anymore. The walls around me had vanished, and now I was surrounded by an endless void, with nothing but the creature watching me as the floor disintegrated beneath my feet. And then it smiled, a smile that shouldn't have been possible for something like that. "The game has begun." The floor gave way completely, and I fell into the void, while the figures laughed, their voices echoing in the darkness. The fall felt endless. My body was plummeting through the void, with no wind, no sound, no sense of time or space. Everything around me was pure darkness, but somewhere I could feel something watching me. Not just the creature from the operating room. No, this was bigger, older, like the darkness itself had a life of its own and was slowly devouring me. Suddenly, a faint light appeared below me, growing quickly as I fell. The impact I was expecting never came. Instead, I was gently lowered onto what seemed to be a glass floor, reflecting my face from every angle possible. But the reflection wasn't mine. The images on the floor showed a distorted version of myself, deep-set eyes, pale skin, and a disturbing smile that I would never make. The other versions began to move on their own, banging against the glass from the inside, as if they were trying to break out. "Welcome to the bottom." The creature's voice echoed around me, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. The surroundings started to shift. The glass floor cracked beneath my feet, and the cracks spread until they revealed projected images below me. They were scenes from the hospital. Corridors I recognized, but empty and cloaked in shadows. I saw the security room, with the monitors showing images that made no sense. The camera from the amphitheater was still on, but it was showing something horrifying. The figures in the seats were now standing in a circle around something that couldn't be seen. Before I could process what I was seeing, a sharp pain shot through my head, like something was trying to force its way into my mind. I heard voices, hundreds of them, all speaking at once. Disjointed phrases, screams, and whispers that made me collapse to my knees. "You need to remember, he's coming. No one leaves. The contract has been broken." The last phrase echoed louder than the others, reverberating like a siren in my ears. Instinctively, I screamed, trying to silence the voices, but it only made the pain worse. That's when I saw it again. The creature from the surgery table was now hovering in front of me, larger than before, its translucent body pulsing with dark lights that seemed to consume any hope of escape. Its silver eyes glowed intensely, focused on me, while its mouth moved without making a sound. But I understood. "You are the last." Its voice finally came, cutting through the silence with an almost pitying tone. "Last what?" My voice came out weak, almost inaudible. "Last Guardian. The hospital is not just a place. It's a barrier, a portal, and you were chosen to protect it." Those words made no sense, but at the same time, something inside me seemed to recognize them. My body began to shake, not from fear, but from something deeper, a connection I didn't know existed. The creature approached, its presence overwhelming. Before I could step back, it extended a deformed arm and touched my forehead with a finger cold as ice. The vision before me exploded in light, and images began to flood my mind. The hospital, the contract, the rules, and the consequences of breaking them. I saw everything. The shadows in the hallways, the patients who weren't human, the previous security guards being consumed by what failed to contain them. And, above all, I saw what would happen if the portal fully opened. "You can protect or fail," the creature said, pulling its finger away. When the light faded, I found myself back in the amphitheater. But something was different. The sheet on the table was empty, and the figures in the seats had vanished. Everything seemed too calm until I noticed one detail. A mark had appeared on my right arm. It was a symbol I didn't recognize, glowing with a faint, pulsating light, like a heartbeat. I touched it, and an intense pain shot through me, accompanied by a final vision. A door that should never have been opened, now ajar, with something dark and colossal waiting on the other side. The radio on my belt exploded with static again, and the voice from before, now clearer, cut through the silence. "It's too late. He's already here." The light in the amphitheater went out completely. Behind me, footsteps began to echo, slow, heavy, and growing closer. And then, in the moment I felt a presence right behind me, everything went silent. The silence was deafening, as if the world had stopped. My body was paralyzed, a cold sensation running through my veins, and my breathing grew heavier with every passing second. I knew something was there, in the shadows, waiting, but I couldn't move. I couldn't think. All I could feel was the presence, something indescribable, something that had existed long before the hospital was ever built, long before anyone was hired there. "You still don't understand, do you?" The creature's voice echoed, now louder, closer. I tried to turn my head, but my body refused to obey. Every fiber of my being was in a state of absolute panic. But something inside me rebelled, and finally, my feet moved. The sound of heavy footsteps reverberated through the room, as if the very environment was collapsing around me. I ran, not knowing where to go, but something was guiding me. A primal instinct, something rooted in those rules I'd learned over time. I ran through the dark hallways of the hospital, not looking back, but the feeling of being followed was inevitable. It was as if the corridors themselves were distorting as I moved forward, creating an endless maze. I reached a door. It was locked, but without thinking, I slammed into it. The doorknob turned easily, as if it had been waiting for me. When I entered, the room was empty, or at least, it seemed that way. There was only one chair in the center, a cold, worn metal chair, as if it had been used by generations of people. "You made it this far, but are you ready for what comes next?" The voice, now deep and resonant, seemed to envelop the entire room. I knew something was about to happen, but I didn't know what. The chair seemed to call to me, as if it were forcing me to sit in it. I hesitated, but the urge was too strong. I sat. The moment I did, everything around me unraveled. The hospital, the lights, the shadows, everything vanished in an explosion of pain that shot through my head. My vision blurred, and a sensation of falling took over me, as if I were being pulled down to a place where there was no light, where time didn't exist. And then the truth surfaced. An image formed in my mind, a clear vision, and I saw what was happening. The hospital wasn't just a place. It was a portal, a barrier between worlds, and the rules I had followed were the chains that kept it closed. But there was a key, and that key was in my hands, the symbol engraved on my arm. I was the key. I had always been the key. The sound of something heavy dragging across the floor behind me made me freeze. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see what was approaching, but an invisible force forced me to turn my head. The door to the room slowly opened, and a dark figure emerged, with red eyes that glowed in the darkness. Its shape was indistinct, a mass of twisting shadows, and as it drew closer, something began to materialize behind it, a giant hooded figure with an overwhelming presence, as if the very gravity was being distorted by its existence. I couldn't breathe. I knew what it was. The guardian of the portal, the entity that had been waiting, the true reason behind the rules I had never questioned. And now, it was behind me, ready to collect its price. When I finally managed to look forward, the chair I had been sitting in had disappeared, and I was in the center of an endless corridor, with doors opening and closing on their own, distorted images and sounds flowing through them. "You have a choice," the hissing voice said, coming from all directions. "You can become the new guardian, or release what is trapped." I didn't know what to do. The decision consumed me, swallowed me like a wave. But before I could think of anything, the creature took a step forward, and the sound of something breaking echoed through the room. Then, a shadow rose behind it, bigger than anything I had ever seen, a dark mass, with glowing eyes that were no longer human. "There is no more choice," it said, with a smile that didn't belong to a living being. "The door has opened." The last thing I saw was the shadow covering everything. The darkness enveloped me completely. There was no light, no sound, just the feeling of being pulled into an endless abyss. It felt like I was falling, but without end, without ground. The pressure in my ears increased with every passing second, and the pain, which had once been a slight discomfort, now seemed to spread throughout my entire body. I tried to scream, but my throat felt dry, as if everything around me was consuming me. I no longer knew where I was. The room had disappeared. The walls, the corridor, the entire hospital no longer existed. All that remained was a deep void, a vacuum that crawled through time, as if the very universe was about to unravel. But then, the darkness shattered. A beam of light blinded me for a moment. When my vision returned, I realized I was no longer falling. I was back. No, it couldn't be. The environment around me was unrecognizable, but at the same time, it felt familiar. The hospital, or what was left of it, was torn apart. The walls were cracked, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of ash. And there, in the center of the room, was the creature. It was no longer just an indistinct shadow. Now, it had form. Its eyes glowed like red stars and pulsed with an energy that made the air around me vibrate. The figure that had once been hooded was now exposed. It was a gigantic being, with skin as dark as night and long claws that scraped the floor with a metallic sound. "You don't understand," the voice echoed again, but this time it came from all corners, as if the very environment was speaking. "You were always a part of this. The hospital, the key, the rules. All of this was a test. And now you failed." I couldn't run. My body refused to obey. It felt as if the ground beneath my feet was trapped in some kind of magnetic field. "You can't escape now." The creature approached, its heavy steps reverberating through the shattered walls. "You've chosen. Now, we are one." It raised one of its claws, and as it touched the air, a distortion began to form, as if tearing the very fabric of reality. The space in front of me bent, and I realized I was no longer in the hospital. Now, I was in limbo, in a plane of existence where time didn't make sense, where the laws of physics didn't apply. I was facing a portal, but it wasn't a portal like the ones I knew. It was a dark rift, a crack in the universe, on the other side of which I could feel power concentrating, an energy that seemed to emanate from something very ancient, far beyond what I could comprehend. The creature leaned in close to me, its red eyes locked on mine. "You will free us. You will open the way." It smiled, but the smile wasn't human. It was a smile of victory, a promise that whatever lay beyond that portal would manifest. I couldn't let that happen. I knew that if it did, the world as I knew it would fall apart. But how could I stop something so powerful, so beyond my understanding? Not knowing what else to do, I looked at my hands. The same mark I had seen before, the one that seemed to have burned itself into my skin. was now glowing with a red light. It hit me, too late, that this mark was the key. The key I never wanted to understand. Now! Make your choice, the creature whispered, its voice now a deafening scream. Free us or be consumed. I was at my breaking point. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Every second was a test, a pressure for me to make a decision. But before I could act, a wave of pain shot through my body, as if something was tearing my soul in two. The pain made me fall to my knees, and that's when I saw it. It was like a part of me was splitting off, a darker, more twisted version of myself beginning to form before my eyes. It was me, but it wasn't. It was a corrupted version, a projection of what would happen if I gave in. The creature looked at my distorted form and laughed, its laughter echoing in the emptiness. The choice has already been made. I no longer knew what was real and what wasn't. The pain, the emptiness, and the presence of that entity were consuming me. Deep down, I knew there was no choice left. I was lost. But what came next? What would happen to this world? I was about to find out. The sound of the portal opened once more, and the darkness closed in around me. And it was in that moment that reality began to unravel. I didn't know if I had made the right choice, but something told me that the consequences were going to be far greater than I could have ever imagined. The last thing I saw was a massive shape emerging from the portal, its red eyes glowing in the dark, and the feeling of being swallowed by an endless abyss. But then a voice whispered softly in my ear, "Now! It's too late to turn back." The darkness consumed everything. There was no more pain, no sensation, no time. All I knew was that I was being dragged to a place where the rules of the world, of reality, no longer applied. It was as if an invisible force was pulling me to the center of an endless vortex. The creature, or whatever it was still there, its presence spreading throughout the environment. There was no more hospital, no trace of what had once been my life. I tried to scream, but my voice was trapped in my throat, suffocated by the pressure of those forces that seemed to be swallowing my very existence. The walls around me twisted, as if they were being eaten away by something beyond human comprehension. The ground beneath me was fragmenting, and I found myself falling again, but this time with no ground, no bottom. And then, in the midst of the chaos, I heard a voice. It wasn't the creature's, but a familiar voice, distant, as if it came from a deep place inside me. "You're losing the battle, but you don't have to fight alone." The voice was soft, almost like a whisper, but it had an undeniable strength. I tried to focus, trying to understand what was happening, but something inside me already knew. That voice wasn't from someone else. It was mine, but it wasn't. "It's too late, isn't it?" I asked, feeling the words leave me like a distant echo. What happened to everything? To the hospital? To the rules? I should have never come here. The voice answered, now clearer, as if it were projecting itself from deep within my mind. "You followed the rules like all those before you, but now you're trapped in the cycle. There is no return, no escape." I looked around, seeing nothing but infinite darkness. It was as if everything had vanished, leaving only emptiness. And then, deep within that void, a shape began to materialize. It wasn't the creature anymore, but something much larger, far older, an immense and indescribable presence that seemed to consume all the light around it. This shape began to speak, and its words reverberated within me, distorted, as if coming from another dimension. "You were never in control. You were never the guardian. You were the chosen one." A wave of loss and despair washed over me, and I almost gave in to the idea that I had failed. But something deep inside me refused to accept that defeat. I knew, with a cold shiver down my spine, that there was more to all of this. Something I still didn't fully understand, but something I had to face now. I took a deep breath, trying to regain some control, trying to focus on what was left of my humanity. Chosen for what? I yelled, not sure if I was speaking to the entity or to myself. And it was at that moment that the massive form drew closer, its shadows stretching toward me. I felt an overwhelming weight, as if reality itself were bending over my head, about to break. Yet, something inside me sparked a flicker of understanding. I realized I had been chosen for something no other man had been. The hospital, the rules, all of it. It was just the surface of something much deeper, something rooted in me, something I had to face. The creature wasn't just trying to destroy me. It wanted to free me, or was it just another prison in disguise? Now you see, don't you? The voice whispered, more a breath than a word. You never escaped. You've always been part of this. That's when the emptiness around me began to fill with images, flashes of other moments, other people, other lives, each one connected to me in some way. All the secrets, all the rules, they were beginning to make sense. I was the final link, the point of convergence between this world and the abyss beyond it. And now, before me, the portal was open. What I didn't know was that there was something more within that portal, something that wouldn't just test my mind, but take my soul. I saw writhing shapes, massive shadows trying to pull me in, as if the portal were a reflection of all my worst fears. And I was about to be dragged into that abyss. You have a choice, the voice hissed, as the emptiness around me expanded. But it won't be easy. It will never be easy. I looked at the portal. Something was calling to me from within it. Something that knew exactly who I was. I couldn't run anymore. The portal before me was a blend of light and darkness, a living contradiction pulsing with an indescribable force. I felt like I was on the edge of something I couldn't fully understand, but that, somehow, was already a part of me. The air was dense, as if reality itself were disintegrating, and the weight on my shoulders was unbearable. I hesitated for a second. The voice inside me, the same one that had spoken before, was now louder, more present. You have a choice, it repeated. You can be just another piece, another lost guardian, or you can accept what you truly are. What am I? The question echoed in my mind like thunder, reverberating through every cell in my body. I wanted to understand, wanted to know the purpose of it all. But something inside me told me I already knew the answer. I hadn't been chosen by chance. The hospital, the rules, everything I'd lived through, it was all part of a bigger cycle. I wasn't just the guardian of the hospital or of those rules. I was part of the very system that governed all of this, a piece of something much greater. I took a deep breath, trying to find courage amid the chaos. My hands trembled, but something inside me began to solidify, as if an invisible force were shaping me, making me stronger. I didn't know what lay beyond that portal, but I knew I couldn't let the cycle continue. I couldn't become just another victim, another puppet in the hands of the entity waiting. I took a step forward. The ground beneath me seemed to give way, and the shadows of the portal stretched out like tentacles, trying to drag me in. I closed my eyes for a moment, as if I could escape reality, but then the voice, now clearer than ever, hit me with a brutal truth. There is no escape. The only way to break the cycle is to replace someone. I froze. Replace someone? Who? Me? Who would be the final victim? In the next instant, something changed. I felt a presence beside me. It wasn't the creature, but something else. Something that seemed human. A shadow moving at the edge of my vision. I tried to focus, and then the figure appeared before me. It was a man. His face was pale, expressionless, and his eyes were empty, as if he had been consumed by the darkness. "You're not alone," he said, his voice echoing in the vastness. "But this is your choice. You must decide, live as a guardian or as the last piece of the puzzle." I looked at him, and something deep within my eyes recognized that figure. He was another like me, someone who had been consumed, who had accepted his fate. But I didn't want to follow the same path. I didn't want to be just another lost soul in that abyss. With a silent scream, I took the final step, feeling the weight of the portal consume me. The darkness engulfed me entirely. And then, Everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the hospital. But it wasn't the same hospital. The walls were intact, and daylight filtered through the windows. Everything seemed normal, as if nothing had happened. But something was off, something that couldn't be explained. The rules, they were still there, invisible but present. I felt them all around me, as if the hospital had never been just a physical place. It was a reflection, an extension of something bigger, something darker. I walked through the halls, and everything seemed fine. But when I looked at the faces of the patients and staff, something told me that something had changed. Not physically, but inside me. I was the last guardian, but the entity that had guided me here hadn't left. It was still with me, waiting for a moment, waiting for an opportunity. The rules, which once seemed like mere impositions, were now a part of me. I was more than just a simple caretaker. I was now the final link, the convergence point between the hospital and the abyss beyond it. The hospital would never be the same again. I would never be the same. And so, the final rule was engraved in my mind. The guardian never stops guarding. I was trapped in the cycle, forever,